He said, "My mother doesn't want you here." I smiled. Then I walked into her mansion and found the truth that would end them. The foyer swallowed me whole. Polished wood that gleamed like teeth, a chandelier that breathed fragile light, and a hush so practiced it felt rehearsed. Guests moved like pieces on a board, polite, polished, perfectly placed, while a soft murmur of champagne and gossip threaded the rooms. For a moment I let the scene wash over me and played the part they expected. The smiling wife, the gracious guest. Inside, I was cataloging everything. By the end of the night, they would be exposed. I won't pretend I didn't feel the ache. I won't pretend my hands didn't tremble when he said those words. But I also won't lie about the quiet that settled after. The kind of silence that sharpens the senses and makes you notice the small betrayals you once forgave. The way someone's laugh hangs a fraction too long. The way a photograph can be turned, face down. The way a name can be skipped in a speech with the softness of an accident. If you've ever been backstabbed by those closest to you and fantasized about the perfect revenge like subscribe and comment your own story below, this one's going to hit hard. I could have left. I could have put on a coat and walked out into the cold night. Let them keep their polished life and pretend I didn't see the cracks. But there was a truth tucked behind the silk and crystal that would not let me walk away. I'll start at the beginning. How we met, what I trusted, and the small things that became a pattern, and I'll show you how I planned everything. Not for cruelty, for justice, for the quiet restoration of a life they tried to make small. So sit with me close. Hear the creak of the floorboards. Smell the lilies fading on the table. Feel the tension like a held breath. I'm telling you everything. The humiliations, the late-night searching, the allies I found, and the moment the house went still and the truth stepped into the light. This is the night they expected me to leave. This is the night I stayed. They called it an inauguration, but the house was already wearing its history like a dress, fitted, polished, untouchable. I remember the first time I stood in that long entryway and felt it, the way the light pooled under the chandelier like liquid glass, the air smelling faintly of lilies and lemon polish. Every surface gleamed. Every face was practiced. It should have felt like a celebration. Instead, I felt like an exhibit. I am the sort of woman who notices small things, little patterns, the exact way my husband laughs when he's genuinely amused versus when he is startled into politeness. The way guests lean toward my mother-in-law when she begins to tell a story as if each word has been scored for applause. I grew up in a house that smelled of cumin and dust and an open window in monsoon season. I learned patience there and how to keep my pride folded neatly under my sleeve. When I met Omar, I thought I'd found the gentle center to my life. Someone who laughed at the same offbeat parts of a movie, who left his socks on the bathroom floor with the kind of tenderness you buy small and forgive quickly. Omar is warm. He is quietly affectionate, the kind of man who will hold my hand in the dark and let his thumb trace lazy circles over my knuckles. But there is another Omar, one I saw that night repeatedly, who moves differently when his mother is near. That Omar straightens, softens his voice, and favors his mother's opinions as if they were carved in marble. It's a subtle shift, and you only notice it if you have the patience to watch. I had that patience once. His mother, Layla, deserves description because she was crafted like a persona. Charismatic is the simplest word. She had the soft, careful smile of someone who had practiced charm in private and deployed it publicly with ease. She rules not with shouts, but with an architecture of small courtesies that always, eventually, bend the room to her will. People called her gracious. They called her a visionary for restoring the old house and turning it into a salon where the right people circulated like rare birds. She collected causes like she collected art, selectively, publicly, and always where light would find them. Tonight, the inauguration, was a thing of ritual. The driveway was a vein of black poured with cars, and the valet opened doors like a red carpet rehearsal. Women in silk and fitted coats stepped across stones that had been power washed until each pebble flashed. I wore a dress Omar had loved on me months ago. It was simple, honest, a color that read well in photographs. He kissed my forehead in the car and said, soft and casual, "You look beautiful." His voice was mine in that small corner of the world, the one that still belonged to us. Inside, the mansion breathed like a giant animal having its favorite people over. The foyer swallowed the sounds of arrival and spat them into a net of polite conversation. Art hung like statements on the walls. Bold strokes, gilded frames, placards that made you sound clever if you read them aloud. Crystal glasses flashed in hand like miniature mountains. The staff moved with choreographed efficiency. A server slid an amuse-bouche across a silver tray and it vanished from my fingers before I could savor the taste. The air carried a mixture of scents, citrus, floral, the sharpness of expensive perfume, and, beneath it, something faintly metallic from the cutlery that clicked on plates. I watched the room and catalogued. People I'd met once or twice gave me the polite nod reserved for acquaintances. A woman in emerald silk asked me, "So, how long have you been in the city?" and smiled as if she'd seeded a conversation and was waiting patiently for a sprout. I answered the way one does in rooms where the stakes are measured by social currency. Short, friendly, unthreatening. I made small talk. It felt rehearsed, like an actor on stage who knows her cues. There were glimpses of our life before this house took on its gravity. Omar and I had met at the library of all places. He was arguing with a student about the merits of a forgotten novel, and I found his righteousness endearing. We dated beside river promenades and under flickering streetlights. He once brought me a packet of cheap cookies he'd bought from a bakery 2 hours before closing, because it reminded him of a childhood treat his grandmother used to make. I cooked him meals he said tasted like home. We saved when we could, argued gently about paint colors, and promised ourselves small luxuries we would one day afford. Those small luxuries led, eventually, to invitations and dinners and the easing of our old worries into new ones. At first, the slights were small enough to be plausible, a joke at a dinner that ended with me laughing while Omar's mother raised a perfectly arched eyebrow and said, "Isn't that precious?" in a tone so soft it made an edge of ridicule. Once, at a small family gathering, Layla reached to move a photograph from the drawing room mantel and turned it face down as if dusting. I smiled and made some remark about changing decor. They all laughed, gentle, indulgent laughter, like a family that shared a private script. I let it pass. I was the new person in their theater. The stage had a choreography I might never fully learn. The first public slight, what I later called the naming, came at a luncheon during the house's restoration phase. It was a small affair. A handful of women who had ties to charities, a luncheon of influence. I had been invited as Omar's wife, formally and politely, and I arrived with a salad tucked in a paper box because nutritious food calmed me. We sat in a sunlit room, the morning pouring through gauze curtains. Layla presided with a practiced warmth, cutting strawberries and arranging them like a demonstration. She made a comment about my cooking one day in that soft voice. "You must show me your recipes sometime. I don't mean to be forward." It was said like a compliment, but the way she said it brushed past me, as if the offer existed for the air and not for me. A woman nearby, one of her friends, turned the conversation and asked about family names. "So," she said casually, "what is your full name again?" It sounded innocent enough. I answered briefly, my family name, the town I came from, and my voice fit the cadence of the room. The friend smiled and repeated it to herself like an address being filed away. Later, in a toast that was supposed to feel spontaneous, Layla raised her glass and spoke effusively about families merging, about the joy of bringing new faces into a home that has always known its place. Her smile never touched her eyes. I watched Omar's face for the small spark of defense that once would have leapt to my side. He raised his glass dutifully. Soft eyes, small smile, but he did not speak. The toast closed with applause, and people moved on with the speed of dealing with an incident that would be talked about in a whisper and then shelved. Back then, I told myself it was nothing. I told myself I was being overly sensitive, that marriage required a softening of edges and a tolerance for family quirks. I told myself that a house like that had its own gravity and that it was only natural to orbit around its owner. But the sense of being othered collected like residue. The small humiliations, being left off the email thread that coordinated guest profiles, the casual remark about how I should learn certain social graces eventually, stacked like plates waiting to be used in some perfect storm. There were private moments of tenderness, too. Omar would take my hand in the quiet of our bedroom and say he loved me. He would tell me how proud he was of what I'd achieved at work. He brought me flowers once for no reason and tucked a note into the stems that said simply, "You are my home." Those words kept me anchored, but even the most secure anchor can fray if the rope is rubbed raw at the same spot over and over. I began to notice the phrase. During the restoration, Layla threw an open house to show local benefactors what her team had accomplished. It was the kind of event where reputations are polished and new narratives are seeded. I arrived and watched people glide through corridors of newly hung art. I smiled, made the right small talks, and practiced the face of a woman who belonged. I remember taking part in a staged photograph beside a fountain, one of those moments where everyone is told to look natural. The camera flashed. Everyone positioned themselves like a living postcard. When the picture developed weeks later, my face was there, polite and present, but something had been altered. A hand, perhaps, had shifted a little. A person who had been standing beside me was somehow moved. Years later, my sister joked that it was as if someone had edited me into place like a correction on a page. There were offhand comments, Layla remarking that some people grow into society as if it were an animal you watch mature. Once, over tea, she told me about a charity gala she chaired and in the same breath asked, "Do you ever worry about how you will be seen?" and smiled. The implication wrapped itself in a ribbon of concern. It stung. It all felt manageable until the night of the inauguration, until the crowd hummed and glasses chimed and someone made a joke that landed on my jaw like a soft palm. I had been chatting with a woman who admired my dress when I felt a hand lightly tug my sleeve. Omar stood there, his expression folded into something unreadable. He leaned close and said in a voice only I could hear, the words a feather that landed somewhere heavy inside me. "My mother doesn't want you here." Time narrowed. My mouth formed a polite smile because that is what you do when a room watches. I felt the champagne fizz in my throat like a tiny displaced volcano. It was as if the entire house exhaled and waited to see what I would do. I could taste the sugar on my tongue and the sting of salt from a flaked pastry in my molars. The clink of silver sounded louder than it had any right to. My breath caught and hung on a thread. For a beat, I thought he was joking. He couldn't be serious. Then, I felt the shoulder of the woman beside him shift minutely, the whisper of her perfume like a map drawn between people. He looked at me with something that might have been apology. It might have been something else, not defiant, not protective, the look of a man who had been born and trained to soften his edges around his mother's wishes. I said nothing. I let the silence do what it would. The room moved on like a careful clock. Conversation resumed. A servant pushed a tray of canapés forward and people reached. Laughter threaded itself through an otherwise quiet moment, filling spaces as if to hide an awkwardness. I felt my hands at my sides like weights. I smiled. I said to the woman who had been speaking moments before as if nothing had shifted, "That's quite a dress. Where did you get it?" Her answer came smoothly, practiced. My voice felt small. He had said it. He had said the one sentence that, in its simplicity, rearranged everything between us. My chest felt hollowed for a breath, the place where oxygen was supposed to be replaced by a hollow ledger of all the small compromises I had written down and forgiven. I looked at him, trying to read an explanation in the line of his mouth. For now, there was none. The night continued its ceremony, and yet the whisper hung there, like a bell that had been struck and would continue to vibrate long after the room had returned to polite clatter. My hands trembled just a fraction, the movement almost unnoticeable. I felt something harden quietly inside me. It was not rage at first. It was not plans or strategies. It was the cold, bright clarity of recognition. That the person I had thought I knew in all rooms was a person who would sometimes choose the shapes of others over the shape of me. The chandelier reflected light into 1,000 tiny prisms. Someone laughed. A fraction too loud. Conversation slid. I pressed my lips together and practiced the face of a woman who belongs, while knowing, with a small sharp certainty, that belonging had been questioned in the most polite way possible. My heart still beat. The night had not yet ended. Then, as if to puncture the fragile hold I maintained, Omar leaned closer and said again, this time a fraction softer, in a tone threaded with both pity and inevitability, "My mother doesn't want you here." The words landed, and the world narrowed to that sound. I stood there, smiling, because that is what you do when the floor drops out from under you in a room full of witnesses. Smile, nod, pretend the words you just heard didn't rearrange the furniture inside your chest. My mind raced ahead and lagged behind at the same time. Did he really say that? Did I misunderstand? Was this some awkward joke I hadn't caught yet? No, he had said it. The disbelief came first, sharp and almost clean. Then humiliation followed, sticky and slow. Confusion wrapped itself around both, tightening with every second I stood there pretending to belong. I could feel the heat in my cheeks, the faint pressure behind my eyes that warned me tears were nearby. I pushed them back. Not here. Not in this house. Not for them. The room didn't stop. It never does. Conversations slid seamlessly into new grooves. Laughter resurfaced like trained birds, and the mansion carried on as if nothing significant had occurred. That was the cruelest part. How quickly the moment was absorbed, disguised, smoothed over. I became invisible in stages. First, the whispers. Not loud enough to confront, not quiet enough to ignore. Names floated just beyond my hearing, syllables softened into polite concern. A woman I'd spoken to earlier glanced at me, then looked away as if she'd suddenly remembered an appointment elsewhere. Another smiled too widely and said, "Oh, excuse me," as she shifted to stand closer to Layla, her shoulder subtly blocking my path. Then came the forgetting. A man holding a champagne flute gestured in my direction and said, "And this is—" His voice trailed off. He looked at Layla for help. She tilted her head, smiling as if searching her memory, and said lightly, "Oh, yes, of course." She never said my name. The moment passed. They laughed, as though the lapse itself was charming. I felt myself being edited out in real time. Seats were rearranged at the long table near the windows. A place setting that had been beside Omar was shifted, for better balance. A chair appeared 2 spaces down, angled slightly away from the center of the conversation. No one announced the change. It simply happened, as naturally as a tide pulling back from shore. I sat where I was guided, my dress whispering against the chair, the sound too loud in my ears. I watched Omar during all of this, watched the way his shoulders tightened when he noticed the shift, watched him open his mouth once as if to say something, then close it again when his mother's eyes flicked toward him. Not sharp, not threatening, just expectant. He caught my gaze for a moment and gave me a small, apologetic smile. The kind you give when you plan to explain everything later. The kind that asks for patience without promising justice. When someone made a comment about the seating, he laughed softly and said, "It's crowded tonight." Minimizing, smoothing, filing the moment down until it fit neatly into nothing. I learned that night how many versions of a man can exist in a single room. When his mother praised the renovations, he nodded eagerly, adding details I'd heard him criticize in private. When a guest made a pointed remark about outsiders adjusting to legacy spaces, he smiled too quickly, eyes darting toward me, then back to safety. Once, when Layla said, "Some people take time to learn the rhythm of these gatherings," he said, "She's getting there," as if I were a project, not his wife. I swallowed each moment like a bitter pill. Later, in a quiet corner near a sculpture that looked like a frozen wave, I asked him softly, "What's happening?" I kept my voice low, careful not to attract attention. He sighed, rubbed the bridge of his nose, and said, "You're reading too much into it. She's just stressed. This night means a lot to her." As if meaning were a justification. As if my presence were an inconvenience measured against her comfort. The night pressed on. I drifted, a satellite losing orbit. I sipped champagne that tasted increasingly sour. The bubbles burned my throat. My laughter sounded false even to me, arriving a second too late, leaving a second too early. I checked my phone twice without knowing why. When the speeches began, I stood near the back, partially obscured by a pillar. Layla took the center, radiant, gracious, thanking everyone who mattered. She listed names, benefactors, friends, family. Omar's name came easily. Mine did not come at all. The omission felt deliberate, a blank space shaped exactly like me. Applause filled the room. My hands came together automatically, the sound dull. I felt hollowed out like a room after the furniture has been moved. Later that night, much later, I learned that omission had been planned. At home, the mansion still clung to me in pieces. I kicked off my heels in the entryway and stood barefoot on the cool floor, the house quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator and the distant tick of a clock. The silence pressed in. I poured myself a cup of coffee, even though it was late. The first sip was bitter, almost punishing. I welcomed it. It felt honest. Omar moved around me carefully, as if navigating a space where something fragile might break. "She didn't mean it like that," he said eventually. "You know how she is." I stared into my cup, watching steam curl and disappear. I knew exactly how she was. I was starting to understand how he was, too. He went to shower. I stayed in the kitchen, the overhead light too bright, the shadows too sharp. That's when I noticed his jacket draped over a chair. A folded paper peeked from the inside pocket. I told myself not to look. I told myself trust was a muscle that weakened with use. I looked anyway. It was a guest list, not the one we'd seen together weeks earlier. This one was shorter, cleaner, certain names circled. Mine wasn't there. My stomach tightened. I folded the paper back exactly as I'd found it, my fingers steady despite the rush of heat in my chest. That was the first crack. The next came days later when I scrolled through photos posted from the event. Group shots, candid smiles, I recognized faces, remembered conversations. In one picture, I knew I'd been standing beside Omar, my hand on his arm. In the posted version, the frame cut just before my shoulder, cropped, precise. Then there was the text, a message from Layla to Omar that he'd forgotten to delete. I wasn't supposed to see it. I saw only a fragment before the screen dimmed, but it was enough. "I told you this was necessary. She complicates things." Complicates. I lay awake that night listening to the refrigerator cycle on and off, the sound suddenly unbearable. My thoughts moved in circles, replaying the night, aligning moments like pieces of a puzzle that had always been there, waiting for me to stop refusing their shape. I felt resentment rise, hot, justified, and with it a deeper ache, the desire to keep my dignity intact. I would not beg. I would not cry in front of them. But I would not be blind again. The final discovery came almost by accident. I was looking for a document in Omar's study, something ordinary, something I had every right to find, when my fingers brushed against a drawer that didn't open easily. It stuck, resisted, then gave with a quiet click. Inside were neatly stacked papers and an old envelope. Tucked beneath them, a printed email thread. My name appeared once, crossed out in pen. My heart slowed. Whatever had begun as a social snub was something else entirely, and whatever they were protecting, it was valuable enough to lock away and to keep me out at any cost. I closed the drawer softly, the sound final as a decision. Nights grew long in ways I hadn't known were possible. I would lie awake and hear the house replay itself. The clink of a glass, a laugh that cut like a paper edge. The hush that filled the room after a name was omitted. I learned every single inflection in those silences. They marked me like a tally. I told myself small truths to keep from unraveling. This is not your fault. You deserve better. You are not invisible. I repeated them until they became a kind of prayer. Sometimes the truths were fragile, sometimes they felt like lies I was telling to survive. Still, I kept them. The truths and the lies, folded in my pocket like safe change. I would replay that foyer in the dark, the chandelier like a scattering of small suns, the lilies that smelled faint and sweet, the way the staff moved as if on pins and strings. I would remember the exact timbre of my husband's voice when he leaned in to say, "My mother doesn't want you here." I could hear it and still feel it press against my ribs. I began to watch everything with the careful eye of someone who keeps tally. An expression. A glass held too long, the way a curtain was drawn so a conversation could be private and perfectly timed. It was obsessive, perhaps, but obsession has a way of becoming a tool when you sharpen it. Then things escalated. It started small, a toast that left a sting. At a charity dinner, one of those rooms full of high ceilings and the sort of acoustics that make every word seem like a sentence in the paper the next day. Layla stood up, radiant, and delivered a speech about the importance of legacy and reputable partnerships. She praised contributors, she praised taste, she praised pedigree, she praised things that sat uneasily with me as if I were listening from the outside of a glass globe. She paused, smiled the smile that folded people gently into her orbit, and said, "We all know how important appearances are. Some people understand that immediately. Others take a bit of..." And she looked directly at me with that slow, careful regard. Acclamation. The room laughed, softly. Ritual laughter, the kind that spreads warmth over something brittle. My face went hot. I kept my hands on my lap. I wanted to stand. I wanted to challenge her in front of everyone and name the exact thing she was doing. But the woman beside me squeezed my hand just once and leaned away, as if proximity were a signal she didn't want to send. Photos were taken. Photos would be shown in the society pages. Photos would be proof of belonging. During a group shot later, I felt the familiar pressure, someone's elbow nudging, a whisper of movement, a careful arrangement. The photographer called, "Okay, everyone smile," and 100 practiced faces softened. When the picture developed online the next morning, I scrolled through captions and praise and found my own image cropped out of the center. My shoulder missing like a word excised from a sentence. Small things, insignificant things. But the accumulation bruised constantly. And then there was the slander, not crude, not direct, it was an artful thing. A friend, someone I had thought kind, sat across from me at a luncheon and with the sweetest of tones asked, "Isn't it difficult sometimes for outsiders to keep up? You know, with expectations and standards?" It landed like a small stone in water. The ripples spread. A murmur here, a suspicious glance there. I felt the room shift and tighten, as if the air itself had decided to exclude me. My husband's reactions varied like weather. Sometimes he was my cold morning, declaring his loyalty in private with cups of tea and whispered apologies. He would say, "It's nothing. Don't make it into something." He sounded like a man who wanted to believe the world could be smoothed with words. Other times, he was a different thing entirely. He became someone who glanced at his mother and folded into the contour she made. He became someone who measured his replies to match hers. When friends made barbed jokes, he either laughed with them or stayed silent. When I asked him if he would defend me, he would promise little things, small gestures of support that felt hollow when compared to the shape of the affront. His voice would soften into a tone I'd learned to read as avoidance. "She's just anxious," he'd say. "You know how much this means to her." I tried to catalog these versions of him without bitterness. I tried to understand that people are not singular, but empathy has limits, and mine had been tested too many times. I started to notice the incongruities, the small discoveries that, when stitched together, made a fabric I could no longer ignore. A guest list paper that peeped from a jacket pocket. An invitation never sent to me, though it was addressed to Mrs. Omar. A photograph cropped with surgical precision. A voicemail that had been archived. A deleted message that reappeared in my memory like a phantom. I became a quiet thief of truth. I saved messages, I copied emails, I took photos of photos. It felt petty and necessary in the same breath. Each piece of evidence was a pebble I intended to lay across the stream until eventually the water would not pass. There were nights I sat at our kitchen table with the kettle hissing and the house slumbering, watching the glow of my laptop make small islands of light in the dark. I'd type and delete, drafting messages to myself as if the act of writing could clarify ideas. The keyboard clicked in short, solitary rhythms. keys under my fingertips became a metronome that measured intent. My breath came shallow. My hands sometimes shook. I began to sniff around the edges of their world gently, like a dog picking up a scent. I didn't want to be obvious. I wanted to be precise. I asked casual questions at parties. Who arranged the seating? And listened to the fall of answers. I tuned my ear to the cadence of excuses. I asked neutral people about their impressions and watched their eyebrows tilt. I listened to the housekeeper's footfalls and the idle gossip that passed like lint. Someone always let the wrong thing slip when they felt safe. And then, almost by accident, I found an ally. Her name was Mariam. She'd been with the house since long before I arrived. She moved through rooms without being seen and knew things that had nothing to do with gossip and everything to do with memory. Once, when I stopped to admire a framed photograph in a corridor, she stood beside me, wiping a dusting cloth, and said quietly, "They change the frames sometimes. The ones they like, they leave facing forward." She said it like someone revealing a small, obvious map. Her voice had the authority of survival. I started to talk to her in the kitchen when the staff were allowed a break. She would pour tea into chipped cups and listen without the performative cheer of others. One afternoon, as rain hammered the windows and the house smelled of wet stone, I told her a little, and then a little more. She replied with a slow, guarded kindness. "People forget what it took to keep them where they are," she said, "and they're careful not to make the same mistake." She handed me small things, a name, the timing of a meeting, the fact that a photo had been sent to a printer, then retracted. She told me about a courier who had delivered a sealed envelope the night before the inauguration, and how Layla had ordered it placed in the safe. "Not everything that is hidden is innocent," Miriam said, not unkindly. "Some things are hidden because someone knows they would be ashamed to show them." A friend from college, Nadia, reappeared like a small lighthouse. She was a journalist now, one with a soft hunger for truth. We had lost touch over the years until I happened to run into one another at a bookshop. We drank coffee and traded the safe, small stories of life until something in my tone changed and she asked, "What is it?" I told her in fragments. She didn't raise eyebrows or offer platitudes. She said, "Collect everything. Don't throw anything away." She said it like a surgeon preparing for an operation. That was the moment my private grievance began to become something more organized. I made a plan. It was not dramatic. It began with small steps. Save every message, screenshot every social post, copy guest lists, gently ask the housekeeper about deliveries, see if any receipts contradicted what I'd been told. I learned the pattern of the house. When deliveries came, who had access to safes, who handled photographs. I timed alarms and checked logs. I became nocturnal in a way that felt like justice, staying awake because sleep was a luxury those who were comfortable with injustice could afford. I started to plant tests. I would mention a fake name casually and watch whether it was repeated back in the right rooms. I would leave a folded note in a book and see who noticed. It was small theater. It was necessary. There were moments of near discovery that made the world tilt. Once, while I was scanning an old album, Omar opened the door without knocking. He saw me with the album and his face changed, then smoothed into something practiced. "What are you doing?" he asked lightly. I closed the book and said, "Looking." He pretended to laugh. The laugh sounded small in the room. At my lowest, I almost gave up. There were days when dignity felt like a brittle mask and I longed to throw it aside and cry in the street. I imagined the easy comfort of flight, move away, start again. But the thought of leaving with the questions unresolved felt cowardly. I decided, then and there, that I would not flee. I would stay and uncover, not for spite, for truth, for the quiet restoration of a life they had tried to diminish us. And then, one crisp morning while I was sorting through a stack of wedding thank you notes because, apparently, a ritual required me to do so, I found it. It was a photograph, tucked behind a page, almost invisible. At first glance, it looked like any other. Layla and a man I had seen only in the margins of society columns, handshakes and smiles. But when I held it to the light, I saw a detail that made my breath stop. In the foreground, Half hidden, there was a table with papers spread like a map. There was a name on one document, a corporate name I knew, and beside it, a note in handwriting I recognized from a card Layla had written me months ago. On the edge of the photo, a small logo from a bank appeared, and there, stamped faintly, was a date. I sat back hard in the chair. The paper smelled of old ink and dust. The smell of paper hit me the way cold water hits a face. It was both ordinary and electric. I threaded the photograph into my fingers, and for a moment, the room held its breath. Somewhere in the house, a clock ticked. The kettle clicked off in the kitchen. My heart beat under my ribs in a staccato I felt in my throat. This was not a slight any longer. This was evidence. Something moved from being assumed to being provable. Whatever motive there had been to exclude me, whatever advantage or embarrassment they sought to hide, now had an anchor, a name, a date, a bank mark. It became possible to trace. I stood, the chair scraping softly. The house seemed to swirl around me with mundane sounds. The dishwasher hum, the distant traffic, the neighbor's dog, but I heard them like a tide and knew that something in me had shifted. The plan was no longer just a plan. It had to be executed. I slid the photograph into my pocket and took a steadying breath. The air tasted faintly of the lemon cleaner Layla favored. My hands were not steady, but my resolve was. I would have to be careful. I would have to be clever. I would have to be patient. It was the first real proof. And, like most truths that arrive suddenly, it felt both terrifying and freeing. Everything was arranged. I say that not to boast, but because it's true. Once the decision was made, every movement became deliberate. I turned my anger into a ledger. I wrote lists with a careful hand. I made files. I labeled them. I learned how to be methodical in the way a surgeon learns instruments, not with cruelty, but with precision. Step 1 was proof, not the drama of accusation. Proof, receipts, dates, names, photographs, public posts, anything that could be verified by someone who wasn't me and wasn't biased toward Layla's salon of charm. I started at the edges. The guest lists I had found, the cropped photos, the one printed photograph that smelled like dust and old glue. I made copies. I scanned. I printed. Paper has weight. Paper can be shown. Paper does not have a tone of voice that can be smoothed over. Miriam became essential. She moved like a ghost through rooms and memory. She knew schedules, courier routes, where unopened envelopes were kept. She offered me small things, a receipt found behind a ledger, the name of a bank that had transferred funds, the delivery slip for a framed photograph. She never gave things she shouldn't. She handed me things that had been forgotten or discarded. People are careless with the small things, she told me once, pouring tea with hands that had worked decades. They make their own trail. Nadia was the next anchor. She had a poise that made people think twice before lying in front of her. She read motives like newspaper headlines. When I told her fragments, she did the thing journalists do. She smiled and then asked for the receipts. "If you can get me the paper trail," she said quietly, "I'll tell you what it means in public." Her voice was calm, clinical, and oddly comforting. I trusted her because she asked for facts, not for drama. Together, we made a map of leverage and pathways. I listed names who had reason to resent Layla, small contractors who'd been stiffed, volunteers whose donations had vanished, an ex-trustee who had been politely encouraged to step aside. We reached out in whispers and slow texts. Some doors opened, some slammed, people were ashamed, some were afraid, others were relieved to be unburdened. A woman who ran a small charity sent me bank statements. A contractor forwarded emails. A once-dismissed aide sent me a photograph she had kept of a meeting that never made the public scrapbook. I kept everything in a folder I called, simply in my dry humor, Lamp. It sat in a drawer in my study, Lamp. It felt ridiculous and honest. Plan 2 was staging. The reveal had to be surgical. I could have called Layla out in private and demanded answers, but I wanted a public moment that could not be smoothed away with a practiced smile. The mansion was the stage. Their event, the very thing that elevated them in society, would be the room where their story unraveled. Timing mattered. The more public the setting, the less room for scripted damage control. We needed an entry point. A photograph alone might be shrugged at. A document alone could be disbelieved. But a photograph with a paper trail, a witness coupled with receipts, a journalist to frame it into a narrative, those were the pieces. I made a list, short and clinical, confirm the date and time of the next significant event at the mansion. Place allies in positions of audience and authority. Ensure a printed copy of the key photograph and the matching bank document would be visible. Time the reveal just after Layla's toast, when the room's attention was fixed and people were still in their softest states of surprise. Have Nadia ready to speak and release an online summary that would capture the first wave of reaction. Then, I worked the stage. I called in favors with small mortal currency, kindnesses, shared memories, a favor repaid. I asked Miriam to hold a frame for safekeeping in the corridor that had an obvious line of sight from the dining room. I asked Nadia to bring an acquaintance who looked like a quiet benefactor but was actually an editor from a local paper. I arranged for a photographer with a reputation for candid shots to be positioned at the back. I did not lie about intent. I asked for help, and I was given it. Planting evidence felt strange to me. I avoided anything that required me to take something not mine. What I did was place things where they would be seen. A printed photograph slid into an art portfolio that would later be propped open, a set of receipts placed under a stack of brochures at a display table. I was careful to only use copies and things that had been shared with me or given freely. I did not want to become the villain. The truth would stand on its own without tricks. There were logistics. Names had to be where they would matter. A guest list had to include people who would react with curiosity and not deference. Nadia suggested placing a few journalists and a couple of women who had been quietly wronged by Layla, the contractor, the charity head, at different tables. Their expressions would be the echo to the news. People see what other people see, she said. If you seed witnesses, you seed reaction. It sounded cynical. It was, I admit, tactical. Rehearsal became part of the work. I practiced short lines in the mirror, the casual phrase that would prompt Miriam to accidentally show the photograph, the question a friend could ask to draw Layla to the display, the cue Nadia would use to stand and ask for everyone's attention. We developed code words. Blue meant proceed. Rose meant hold. Window meant the photograph should be revealed. I memorized them as if they were prayers. Obstacles arrived on schedule like storm fronts. 2 nights before the event, a delivery man knocked on my door with a package meant for Layla at the mansion. It was a last-minute brochure, the sort of thing you would not normally notice. I accepted it and opened it at home because it bore a logo that mattered. Inside, among glossy pamphlets, was a color proof of a new plaque the mansion intended to install. The date on it matched the night of the event. My stomach tightened. This was good. It was also nerve-wracking because it meant there would be more eyes, more pressure to get everything right. Then, 3 days before the reveal, I nearly ruined everything. I had gone to the study to retrieve a document Miriam had left with me, a copy of an accounting sheet. Omar came in early from work, sotto voce, muttering about a client call. He saw my hands full of papers and smiled that small smile he used when he wanted to deflect. "Are you working late?" he asked. Panic tightened my throat. I quickly slid the folder into a drawer and closed it. My fingers trembled with the possibility that he might notice and ask questions. He opened his mouth as if to speak, then closed it. He kissed my forehead and left. In the span of 3 breaths, the house had almost swallowed the plan I had built. I learned to work in shorter bursts after that. Quick, quiet. The scratch of a pen became a secretive rhythm. The glow of a phone screen at midnight mapped out names. The creak of a hidden stair sounded like a warning. There were times my hands were cold from fear. There were times I paced until my shoes thudded on the floor, a stupid, human noise that made me laugh at myself. A near discovery hit harder a week later. A trustee, a man whose presence had not been on the confirmed list, announced that he would attend after all. He was a friend of Layla's from a previous life and known to be a defender of the household's reputation. My first thought was panic. The plan hinged on certain faces in certain places. The trustee's arrival could tilt the room back towards safety for them. I called Nadia and Mariam in the same breath. Blue, Nadia whispered when I told her. We adapt. We moved seats. We shifted placements subtly. We pulled a college friend into a seat at the trustees' table who would, we hoped, distract him with conversation before he noticed the display. It was improvisation. It worked. In the hours before the event, I learned that plans must be rigid enough to hold truth and flexible enough to bend without snapping. The night before the event, I sat on the edge of the bed and wrote a simple note to myself. No theatrics, no taunts, just show them what was always there. I folded it and tucked it into my pocket like a talisman. Execution felt like both very little and everything. On the morning of the event, I printed additional copies of the photograph and the bank document. I made sure the paper fed correctly and that the ink was dark and stubborn. I wrapped one copy in a thin folder and labeled it, For Display. The photograph's corners were sharp. The bank stamp was faint but visible. I tucked the folder in a small bag and carried it like contraband, though it was only truth. At the mansion, smell wrapped around me, lemon polish and lilies again, but now threaded with the faint tang of stage lights and the nervous sweetness of people preparing to be seen. I moved through the rooms carrying calm like armor. Miriam's hands were steady. You want it on the easel near the piano? She asked. Her voice had a low, steady rhythm. I nodded. Nadia was a silhouette in a navy coat, speaking quietly into her phone. She arched an eyebrow at me, and the code word passed between us without sound. Window. There were last-minute changes. Layla asked to add a new speaker to the program, someone who would surely make the room look even more curated. I swallowed and smiled. She was rearranging. We adjusted. We did not flinch. The little portfolio was propped in the exact spot we had chosen, visible, a little to the left of the piano, angled so that anyone moving down the main aisle would see it if they happened to glance. The first snag came when an aide, a young man with nervous hands and a bright tie, walked by and nearly knocked the easel. He apologized with the hurried flurry of someone trying to be helpful. For a second, my heart stopped. The folder held fast. He straightened the frame and moved on. A small triumph. A suppressed breath. Someone let out a tiny laugh of relief beside me. Music swelled softly, scriptable strings under a chatter of small talk, and then receded. Allies moved like dancers around a stage. Nadia sat where she could see the room and keep a hand on the notes in her lap. Mariam took her place near the service corridor, within earshot of the staff and the photographs. A friend I'd asked to be on the opposite side of the room, a woman who had once been publicly slighted by Layla, took a seat and kept her expression neutral. Don't react until you feel it, I'd whispered to her as she sat. She had nodded, her face a small mask. The guests arrived in a slow flood. I greeted people with the professionalism of someone who has rehearsed politeness until it becomes armor. The chandelier poured soft light. Glasses flashed like small clarions. Layla moved through the room like someone stepping into a well-rehearsed role, distributing charm and that carefully practiced smile. She took the stage with an ease that had been honed. I watched her and felt the old sting, the ache transform into cold calculation. When she finished her toast, there was the small applause of a room that had been primed for warmth. I felt the moment lengthen. The soundtrack in my head was a low hum. My palms were damp. I heard the faint rustle as someone adjusted a microphone. I heard distant footsteps. I felt suddenly, absurdly aware of my own breath. Nadia stood. Her movements were quiet, but she had a gravity that made the room shift. She asked politely for a moment of attention. The sound of her voice was calm. She did not attack. She did not sneer. She said, "There is a document here that some of you should see." It felt small. It felt huge. Miriam pivoted. The easel was open. She walked toward it and, with a casualness that belied everything happening inside her, she leaned over and turned the portfolio so that the photograph lay facing the room. There was a soft intake of breath. The camera at the back clicked once. The photograph was visible. The bank document slipped from beneath and fluttered like a small flag onto the table beside it. A murmur rose, heads turned, a hand lifted to a mouth. The trustee at the end of the room frowned and shifted in his chair. Somewhere in the corner where strings had been playing lightly, the music swelled and then dropped out like a held breath. I watched every face. I watched Layla's smile falter. I watched the practiced charm crack, hairline thin. I watched Omar's eyes find mine. He did not move immediately. For a second, the room hung between two possibilities: containment and rupture. Then the first gasp came, and I closed my eyes for a beat, feeling the coolness of the night air in my lungs, feeling my hands steady because they had to. Music swelled behind me like an oncoming tide. I opened my eyes. Everything was about to happen. They saw it at once, and when Miriam turned the portfolio and the photograph slid into view, the room inhaled. For a heartbeat, everything was filmed in slow motion, the kind of slow that stretches a moment into a life. Glasses froze halfway to mouths. A chandelier's crystals trembled, catching light like a dozen tiny alarms. Someone's laugh died on the rim of a flute and fell, broken. The photograph lay there. The bank stamp on the corner caught a sliver of light. The papers beneath it spread like a proof on a table. Names, dates, transfers, a handwritten note with Layla's looping script. Nadia had the copies ready. She let them circulate like a calm tide. One by one, people read. Eyes narrowed, foreheads furrowed, conversations that had been soft and obliging snapped into sharp threads. I watched Layla first. Her face did what faces do when their script ends and the improv begins. The smile that had been honed for decades tightened. Her eyes narrowed, calculated appraisal, and then, as if a curtain had been pulled so quickly it surprised even her, they widened. Surprise, not innocence. Something else like it. The muscles in her jaw flexed. For a second, she looked very young, the practiced mask slipping to reveal a woman who had been startled into the truth of her own making. Omar moved before I fully understood his intention. He stood, the sound of a chair scraping slow as a drum. He stepped forward toward the easel, hands out as though to gather fragments. "Please, let's not," he began, a small rush of sound that tried to be reason. His voice shook in a way I had never heard. It wasn't anger, it was panic masquerading as propriety. Someone near the piano dropped a glass. The sound was enormous in the sudden quiet. It ricocheted off the walls. Champagne splashed like a small, careless comet across the carpet, leaving a slick path that caught the light. A hand rose to cover a mouth. Camera shutters began to click, first tentative, then like a pulse. The room divided into people who read and people who tried to look away. Layla's hand went to her chest as if to steady a heart that had betrayed her. She opened her mouth and said something that should have been defense but landed as an attempt to discredit. "This is an old photograph," she said. "Context is everything." Her voice carried the studied softness she used for sympathy teas and charity luncheons. But the softness did not work. Paper is stubborn. Paper has dates. A friend of hers, one who had smiled along with her on countless evenings, stared at the paperwork and then at Layla. For a moment, the friendship's veneer trembled. I watched loyalties shift like weather. Some faces tightened into lines of defense. Others receded, as if ashamed to hold the same air as deception. Omar's hand touched my arm then, briefly. It was a gesture that wanted to be steadying, but was not. He leaned in close. His lips were near my ear. "We can explain this," he whispered. The words were urgent and small, betraying his belief that explanation could still smooth an irremediable thing. I felt the hot press of his breath. I felt the obligation of our years like a weight. But the photograph was between us now, literal and public, and explanations had a hard time in that light. He tried to intercede. He spoke to her, softly at first, then with increasing urgency. He asked her to sit, to breathe, to let him handle it. He smiled at the trustee in a way that begged for containment. He spoke to guests, to staff, to anyone who would anchor the evening back to safety. It was a flurry of gestures, the flapping of a wingspan too small to stay a falling bird. But words are thin when the record is thick. Nadia moved with the quiet authority of someone who knows the rhythm of public truth. She pointed at dates, at transfers, at signatures. She narrated, precise and unemotional, and the room listened because she spoke in documents and not in feeling. The editor she'd brought subtle, neutral, leaned forward and murmured into his phone. A woman at the sponsors table paled and excused herself, phone already in hand. Small sounds multiplied, the scraping of a chair as someone stood to leave, the clack of high heels down the corridor, a napkin dropped and forgotten. Every micro-moment felt like film grain magnified, details that, together, made a picture intolerable to ignore. I remember the sensation in my own chest, a tightness like a fist. For a second, my body did not know whether to unclench in relief or clench harder in fear. My mouth went dry. There was a dizzy, absurd laugh that escaped me because something in me was unmaking the knot that had been tied in my throat. Tears followed, not the silent, shameful sort I had practiced in secrecy, but clean ones, saline and exact. They were not for vindictiveness, they were the release of a pressure valve that had been welded shut for too long. Layla's eyes darted through the room, seeking a script. Friends averted their gaze. A sponsor got up and, in a voice measured and polite, said, "We must look into this." The words had the practical deadness of a statement prepared to be repeated in minutes to come. I heard the editor's phones make a low buzzing. First texts, then the unmistakable ping of notifications. The world outside, I knew, would taste this quickly. The trustee, older, usually immovable, rose with a slow deliberation that felt theatrical. He looked at Layla, then at the documents, then at the guests. He walked to the buffet without speaking, and then out into the evening air. His departure was a sentence pronounced. Others followed, some left in clusters, whispering, their faces slack. The room emptied, not in a rush, but like a receding tide, taking with it the perfumed residues of polite pretense. Omar stood in the middle of the change like a man who had been turned inside out. He reached for explanations I had no use for. I watched him go to his mother and speak in a low voice. I watched the exchange become heated, then colder. The words were muffled. The public was no place, and yet everything they said was now public. After a few moments, he turned to me. His face was raw. "I didn't," he began, and then stopped. There are confessions that must be said privately. There are ones that refuse the quiet. Later, away from the camera clicks and the rustle of departing guests, Omar came to the side of the house where the air had cooled. The night smelled of lemon polish faintly bleeding into autumn. He held my hands in his as if feeling for an answer in the lines where my palms met. "I should have stopped it," he said. His voice was small in the large, emptied yard. I knew enough to be suspicious, and I did. Nothing. I was afraid of what she'd do. I thought if I stayed quiet, it would protect us. It was a confession, not of betrayal's intent, but of its complicity. He had not been the architect, but he had been the accomplice of fear. I felt something like grief for the man I had loved and the man who had lived half in his mother's shadow. He asked for forgiveness in a way that had nothing to do with consequences. He asked for understanding. The truth is, forgiveness is earned in time, and my dignity was not something to be bargained with. The immediate consequences unfolded in a practical, efficient way. The charity that had been set to sponsor Layla's next gala issued a quiet statement the following day about reviewing their partnerships. The editor's summary, careful, factual, hit social feeds and was shared and reshared with the mechanical appetite of distance. People called lawyers quietly. Board members requested meetings. It was not dramatic, but it was devastating in the precise, civilized way institutions punish those they no longer trust. Privately, the house changed. Layla's calls went unanswered. Guests who had hung close suddenly had more pressing obligations. The staff moved with a new, weary sort of clarity. Miriam gave me a look one morning over mugs of tea that said, without words, it had to be done. The contractor whose payments had been misdirected stopped taking her calls and forwarded invoices. Small indignations, unsettled, petty, began to untangle into corrections. Documents were requested, records were examined, the comfortable illusion of inevitability cracked and surrendered to audit. The public humiliation was not a carnivorous thing. It was a circuit of consequence. Donors pulled back, committees reconsidered. Reputations that had been propped up by curated smiles found themselves needing genuine repair. For Layla, the prettiness of her life began to sink into practical trouble. For the guests, the pleasantness of being associated with her dulled into the inconvenience of having to explain. For Omar and me, the aftermath sat somewhere between a demands hearing and a grief. We sat at our kitchen table with mugs that steamed like small flags. The house had been both battleground and living room. Everything felt intimate and exposed. He tried to explain again, more carefully this time, and I listened. A fatigued judge. He told me that he had been terrified of losing his inheritance of grace, of being the cause of his mother's downfall. He told me he feared the rupture more than the wrong. He said, softly, "I didn't mean for any of this to hurt you." The admission landed like a stone. I told him plainly that fear is not an excuse. I told him that loyalty to one's mother does not necessitate erasing the person you married. I told him that we would need time and perhaps counsel to see if the pattern between us could be unstitched and resewn in a different way. He nodded, shame and sorrow mixing on his face. He reached for me and I let him sit beside me. We did not decide everything that night. We decided, instead, that the easy routes were no longer available. There were other consequences that felt quieter but lasted longer. My friends, those who had been steady and small, were present, checking in like steadiers. Nadia's peace ran with restraint and evidence, and people emailed me with sorrow and offers of help. The staff at the mansion who had been brave enough to share things were protected, quietly, as best as I could manage. Miriam stayed. She refused offers to leave. "Some things are for keeping," she said. I understood then that justice does not always come with fanfare. Sometimes justice is the careful tending of what is left alive after exposure. And there was, too, a private reckoning inside me. The victory I felt was not the sharp, delicious sort I had imagined. It was quieter, more like a window cleaned after years of dust. I could see outside more clearly. There was relief, yes. There was also exhaustion. The cost of being seen had been high. The cost of staying to see it through had been higher. I walked through the house in the days after and noticed small things I had missed before. A chipped tile near the back door. A paint blotch beneath a radiator. The mansion was still a house with human fault lines, not a perfect altar. I felt the strange liberating knowledge that perfection had been an illusion for everyone involved. Everyone had lives with mess under the rug. Ours simply had the mess revealed. People asked me how I felt. I would say sometimes that it was like the first breath after coming up from deep water. Sharp, burning air that you swallow gratefully. Sometimes I would laugh, abrupt and shaky, because the absurdity of everything, once unmasked, has a way of being funny in a small, dark way. I did not feel triumphant so much as steady. My dignity, bruised and raw, felt reclaimed in small increments. There was a final, quiet ceremony I held for myself, a box of letters I burned in the backyard. Not to be vengeful, but to clear the pages of whatever had anchored me in doubt. The smoke smelled of old paper and lemon polish, and the night was gentle. I watched the embers pull at the edges of memories. They curled, then gave. It felt like a confession to myself. I will not live small because someone else valued control over kindness. They were exposed. The house settled into a new rhythm, less gilded, more honest. Guests who stayed did so with clearer eyes. Friends who left sent notes that said nothing about the spectacle and everything about care. Omar and I began what would be, I knew, a slow process. There were apologies that needed words and actions that needed time. There were boundaries to be drawn, and I drew them with a steady hand. In the end, the exposure had not been about punishment. It had been about truth and the gentle, stubborn work of making space for it. The night they were exposed was not an end so much as a beginning, one that required patience and the long, ordinary labor of rebuilding a life that could stand without being glossed over by anyone else's convenience. They were exposed, but I still had to rebuild my life. Breathe with me for a moment. We came here for one thing, the truth. What followed wasn't a taste of cruel revenge. It was the slow, careful unwrapping of something that had been wrapped so tightly no one could see the seams. What I wanted, in the end, was not to destroy, They already built that for themselves, but to take back my dignity. That, more than anything, felt like a quiet victory. I learned that dignity is not loud. It's the steady folding of boundaries into place. It's the small, stubborn insistence on being treated as if you matter. I learned that silence can feel safe until it becomes a cage. For years, I had softened to protect harmony. In the end, that very protection cost me pieces of myself. Standing up for truth didn't make me cruel. It made me visible. It made me whole again. There is a cost to exposure. There is also a relief. People will judge you for how you choose to set a line. Some will call it petty, others brave. I learned to accept both responses because the alternative was living as a lesser version of myself for the comfort of someone else's reputation. I learned patience. I learned who would stay when the light was harsh and who would leave when it was easy. I learned that rebuilding requires gentleness with yourself, with those who repent, and with the practical work of reassembling a life. If this revenge saga gave you that rush of justice, smash like, subscribe for more epic tales, and share your revenge story in the comments. Click the next video box for another one. Before you go, tell me, have you ever stayed silent when you should have spoken? How did you find your voice again? I read every comment. Your stories are part of why these tales matter. They remind us that truth has weight, and that weight can change a life. The piano fades now, a slow close on a night that changed everything. The house is quieter, the dust settled, my hands are steadier. The work begins again, not the work of plotting, but the work of living fully on my own terms. I am rebuilding.